Look to the rising sun, for I am already setting. These were the last words of a man who spent his entire life trying to master himself. It is March 17th, 180 CE, in a military camp near the Danube frontier, far from the marble palaces and comfortable luxuries of Rome, an emperor lies dying. He is 58 years old, his body weakened by years of war, plague, and the relentless burden of ruling the greatest empire the world has ever known. Around him, soldiers stand in quiet vigil, and his son Commodus waits to inherit an empire. This man had commanded legions, governed millions, and held absolute power over the known world. Yet throughout it all, he kept a private journal, writing late into the night by candlelight, reminding himself again and again of the same simple truths. That virtue is the only good, that death is nothing to fear, that the opinions of others mean nothing if your own character is sound. This is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the philosopher king, and tonight we follow his extraordinary journey from the marble halls of Rome to the mud and blood of the German frontier. A man who never asked to be emperor, yet became the last of the 5 good emperors. A man who wrote one of history's most enduring philosophical works, not for fame or recognition, but as private notes to himself. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now. So, settle in and prepare to walk through the streets of ancient Rome and the battlefields of Germania with a man who believed that philosophy was not just about thinking, but about living. Chapter 1. A Boy Named Verus. On the 26th of April, in the year 121 CE, in a wealthy home on the Caelian Hill in Rome, a baby boy was born. The household was one of distinction and considerable fortune. His father, Marcus Annius Verus III, was a praetor, a high-ranking Roman magistrate, a man who had already proven himself in the complex world of Roman politics and law. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, came from an even more impressive background. She was the heiress to one of Rome's largest fortunes, inherited from both sides of her family. Her wealth included a vast brickworks on the outskirts of the city, an enterprise that generated enormous wealth during Rome's ongoing construction boom. At a time when Rome was rebuilding itself in marble and brick, when aqueducts, forums, and temples were rising across the empire, to own a brickworks was to own a literal gold mine. The child was given the name Marcus Annius Verus after his father and grandfather, a name that carried weight and prestige in Roman society. The Annius family claimed descent from Numa Pompilius, the legendary second king of Rome, though such claims were common among Roman aristocrats and often more about prestige than provable fact. What mattered was that the family believed it, and so did much of Roman society. The Caelian Hill, where the family lived, was one of Rome's 7 hills and home to many of the city's elite. Their house would have been substantial, built around a central courtyard, decorated with mosaics and frescoes, filled with Greek statues and furnishings that displayed both wealth and cultured taste. Slaves and servants moved through the rooms, attending to the family's needs, for no Roman household of this class ran without an extensive staff. From the windows of their house, young Marcus would have seen the city spreading below, the aqueducts carrying water to the public baths, the temples gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun, and the constant bustle of the world's greatest metropolis. The sounds of Rome would have filled his childhood, the cries of street vendors, the rumble of carts on cobblestones, the chants from temples, the roar of crowds at the circus. Rome in 121 CE was at the height of its power. The empire stretched from Britain to Arabia, from the Rhine to the Nile, encompassing perhaps 60 million souls speaking hundreds of languages, but all united under Roman law and the Pax Romana. The Emperor Hadrian, one of the ablest rulers Rome would ever know, sat on the throne, traveling constantly throughout his domains, building walls in Britain, founding cities in North Africa, securing the boundaries of Roman civilization. Hadrian was a Philhellene, a lover of Greek culture, an intellectual who wrote poetry and studied architecture. His reign represented everything refined and cultured about Roman imperial power. But tragedy struck the household when Marcus was only 3 years old. His father died suddenly in 124 CE, leaving his widow Domitia with 2 young children, Marcus and his infant sister, Annia Cornificia Faustina. In Roman society, this could have spelled disaster for the family, but fortune smiled on them in the form of loving relatives. Marcus's paternal grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus II, a man who had served as consul not once, but twice, took the family into his home. The boy would later remember his grandfather with deep affection, praising his courtesy and serenity of temper in his private writings. The household that raised Marcus was one of culture, education, and traditional Roman virtue. His maternal great-grandfather, Lucius Catilius Severus, also took a keen interest in the boy's upbringing. So significant was this influence that Marcus would later add Catilius Severus to his own name in honor of the old man. From his earliest years, Marcus was surrounded by books, philosophical discussions, and the expectation that he would become a man of learning and public service. He was taught Greek and Latin by private tutors, the finest educators that money could buy. He studied literature with Euphorion, drama with Geminus, geometry with Andron, and Greek grammar with Alexander of Kotiaeum. But even as a child, Marcus showed an unusual seriousness of character. While other boys of his class were content to play games and enjoy the privileges of wealth, Marcus seemed drawn to deeper questions. He was quiet, thoughtful, and intensely focused when he studied. This remarkable character did not go unnoticed. The Emperor Hadrian himself, who had a keen eye for talent and virtue, began to take an interest in the serious young boy. Hadrian even gave him a nickname, Verissimus, the most truthful, a play on his family name Verus, which meant true. For a boy not yet 10 years old to catch the favorable attention of the emperor was extraordinary. It marked Marcus as someone special, someone who might be destined for great things. At the age of 6, Marcus was enrolled in the equestrian order, the second tier of Roman aristocracy just below the Senate. At 8, he was made a member of the Salii, an ancient college of priests dedicated to Mars, the god of war. The Salii were known as the leaping priests for their ritual, dances, and Marcus took his duties seriously, learning by heart the archaic prayers and chants that even most educated Romans could no longer understand. These were not just honors, they were signs that Marcus was being groomed for a public career, that his family and the emperor expected much from him. Chapter 2. The Hunger for Philosophy. When Marcus turned 11, something changed in him. Under the influence of a painter and Stoic philosopher named Diognetus, the boy decided to embrace philosophy not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a way of life. he began wearing the rough clothing of the philosophers, a simple cloak instead of the fine togas expected of his class. He wanted to sleep on the floor like the ancient Stoics, though his worried mother convinced him to at least use a simple bed. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that worried his family, driving himself so hard that his health began to suffer. What was it about philosophy that gripped this young boy so completely? To understand this, we must understand what philosophy meant in the ancient world. It was not merely academic study or abstract theorizing. Philosophy was a way of life, a set of practices and beliefs that shaped every moment of your existence. And among the various schools of philosophy, it was Stoicism that captured Marcus's heart and mind. Stoicism taught that virtue, excellence of character, was the only true good. Everything else, wealth, health, reputation, even life itself, was neither good nor bad in itself, but merely indifferent. What mattered was how you used these things, whether you approached them with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. The Stoics believed that the universe was governed by reason, by a divine logic they called the logos, and that human beings, as rational creatures, could align themselves with this cosmic order. They taught that most human suffering came not from external events, but from our own judgments about those events. A Stoic should face death, pain, and loss with equanimity, accepting them as natural parts of existence. Perhaps most importantly for Marcus, Stoicism taught that every person, from emperor to slave, shared in the divine spark of reason and deserved to be treated with respect and justice. These ideas resonated with something deep in Marcus's character. Here was a philosophy that demanded not cleverness or rhetorical skill, but integrity and self-mastery. A philosophy that said the most important battle was not with external enemies, but with your own passions and prejudices. Marcus began reading the Discourses of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the greatest Stoic teachers of the previous generation. Epictetus taught that we should focus only on what is in our control, our own thoughts, intentions, and actions, and accept with serenity everything that is not in our control, which includes nearly everything else in the world. Marcus's tutors now included some of the finest minds in the empire. Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a brilliant orator and lawyer, taught him Latin rhetoric and became a lifelong friend and correspondent. Herodes Atticus, a fabulously wealthy Greek who had built stadiums and aqueducts throughout Greece, taught him Greek oratory, but perhaps his most important teacher was Quintus Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher who would become Marcus's closest advisor and friend. Rusticus introduced him to the works of Epictetus in depth and taught him that philosophy was not about winning arguments, but about transforming yourself. The boy was developing into a young man of remarkable character. He was honest to a fault, hardworking, and serious, but not pompous or self-righteous. He was kind to his family and servants, respectful to his teachers, and indifferent to the luxuries and pleasures that his wealth could have provided. He enjoyed the same activities as other young Roman aristocrats: boxing, wrestling, running, hunting, and ball games, and he was good at them, but his real passion was always his studies, particularly philosophy. As he approached his teenage years, Marcus had no way of knowing that his life was about to change forever, that the attention of emperors would fall upon him, not with favor, but with a burden he never sought. Chapter 3: The Reluctant Heir. The year 136 CE brought dramatic changes to Marcus's life. He was 15 years old, at the age when Roman boys put on the toga virilis, the toga of manhood, and entered public life. For Marcus, this ceremony was particularly significant. Emperor Hadrian himself attended and appointed Marcus prefect of the city during the Latin festival, an ancient religious ceremony where Rome's magistrates processed to the Alban Mount to make sacrifices. While they were away, someone had to symbolically protect the city. That someone was Marcus, barely 15, given responsibility for Rome itself, even if only ceremonially. He performed brilliantly, both at the formal ceremonies and at the banquets that followed, showing poise and maturity beyond his years. But 136 would be remembered for something else entirely. The Emperor Hadrian, who had no biological children, announced that he had chosen his heir. His choice was Lucius Caionius Commodus, a man of good family, but unremarkable achievements. The selection surprised many at the time and has puzzled historians ever since. Hadrian was known for his intelligence and careful judgment. Why choose someone so undistinguished? The most likely explanation is that Hadrian was thinking several moves ahead. Commodus was older, in his 30s, and could serve as a placeholder while the truly intended heir, Marcus, who was still too young, matured. As part of the adoption, Commodus, now renamed Lucius Aelius Caesar, was required to betroth his young daughter, Caeonia Fabia, to Marcus Annius Verus. So at 15, Marcus found himself engaged to be married, tied by family connection to the next emperor of Rome. For most young men of his class, this would have been cause for celebration, a guarantee of power, wealth, and prestige beyond imagination. The path to the highest offices in the empire would be smooth. But Marcus received the news with apprehension rather than joy. The ancient biographers tell us he was unhappy about these developments. He understood what such connections meant, the obligations, the public scrutiny, the end of any hope for a private life dedicated to philosophy. He would be expected to take on political and military roles. He would be watched constantly, his every action scrutinized for signs of loyalty or ambition. The quiet life he valued, the life of study and philosophical contemplation, was slipping away. Still, duty was duty, and Marcus had been raised to serve Rome. Then, in early 138 CE, barely a year after his adoption, Lucius Aelius Caesar fell ill and died. He had been so weak that during the ceremony marking him as heir, he could not lift the ceremonial shield on his own. Hadrian was now desperate. He was himself in declining health, racked by illness, and reportedly in great pain. He needed an heir, and he needed one immediately. This time, he made a different choice. He selected Aurelius Antoninus, the husband of Marcus's aunt Faustina, a wealthy senator known for his integrity and mild temperament. But Hadrian made his adoption conditional. Antoninus had to agree to adopt 2 boys as his own sons and heirs, the young son of the deceased Lucius Aelius, who would be called Lucius Verus, and Marcus Annius Verus, now 17 years old. On February 25, 138 CE, the adoptions took place. Marcus became Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus. His engagement to Caeonia Fabia was broken, and he was instead betrothed to Antoninus's daughter, Faustina the Younger, his own cousin. In a single day, the quiet, studious young man who wanted nothing more than to pursue philosophy found himself second in line to rule the Roman Empire. That night, Marcus had a dream. He dreamed that his shoulders had turned to ivory, and when someone asked if such shoulders could bear a burden, he found they were far stronger than before. The dream was prophetic. The burden that was being placed on his shoulders was immense, and he would need strength beyond what he imagined. Marcus was not happy about his new position. Later, in his private writings, he would note that he had been compelled to take imperial power, that he had a genuine horror imperii, a fear of ruling. His Stoic training, however, made the path clear. It was his duty. Hadrian had planned this succession, had seen something in Marcus that made him worthy of the purple. To refuse would be to shirk responsibility, to place personal preference above the common good. Hadrian died in July of 138, and Antoninus Pius became emperor. The transition was smooth, and Antoninus proved to be exactly what Rome needed: a calm, competent administrator who would give the empire 23 years of peace and prosperity. But from the moment of his adoption, Marcus's life was no longer his own. He moved from his family's house on the Caelian Hill to the imperial palace. His education continued, but now it was preparation for ruling an empire. Chapter 4: The Apprentice Emperor. Marcus spent the next 23 years at the side of Antoninus Pius, learning what it meant to be an emperor. These years, from 138 to 161 CE, were perhaps the happiest of Marcus's life, though they were also years of preparation and increasing responsibility. Antoninus proved to be not just an emperor, but a second father to Marcus. The older man was patient, kind, and wise. He never made a decision without careful thought. He listened to his advisors, but made his own judgments. He was devoted to justice, working long hours to hear legal cases and ensure that the law was applied fairly to rich and poor alike. Marcus watched and learned. He accompanied Antoninus to the Senate, sat in on meetings with governors and generals, learned the intricate details of imperial finance, military logistics, and provincial administration. In 140 CE, at the age of 19, Marcus was made consul, the highest regular magistracy in Rome, traditionally reserved for men much older. This was unprecedented for someone so young, but it was a clear signal that Marcus was being groomed for supreme power. He would hold the consulship twice more during Antoninus's reign, in 145 and 161 CE. Marcus also continued his education. His correspondence with his tutor Fronto survives in patches, giving us a glimpse of the young man behind the imperial dignity. The letters show Marcus's genuine affection for his teacher, his love of learning, his struggles with rhetoric, and his growing obsession with philosophy, particularly Stoicism. Fronto, who valued eloquence and the art of persuasive speech, was sometimes frustrated by Marcus's preference for philosophy over rhetoric, but their friendship remained warm. In 145 CE, Marcus married Faustina the Younger, his cousin and the daughter of Antoninus. He was 24, she was perhaps 16. The marriage appears to have been genuinely affectionate. Over the years, Faustina would bear Marcus at least 12 children, perhaps as many as 13 or 14. The imperial couple faced terrible sorrows, as was common in an age of high infant and child mortality. Many of their children died young, some as infants, some as small children. Marcus's letters speak of his and Faustina's devotion to their sick children, sitting up with them through long nights, their anxiety and grief when the little ones died. Of all their children, only 6 would survive to adulthood, and ultimately only 5 would outlive their father, the most famous being their daughter, Annia Lucilla, and their son Commodus. The years passed in what seemed like peace. Antoninus governed Rome from the city itself, never once leaving Italy during his entire reign. This was unusual. Most emperors spent years traveling the provinces, inspecting frontiers, commanding armies. But Antoninus believed in stability and continuity. The empire ran smoothly under his careful administration. Marcus studied, worked, grew into manhood, and then into middle age. He developed a reputation for seriousness, for fairness, for his philosophical disposition. Yet even during these peaceful years, Marcus was aware that all things change. The Stoics taught that the universe is in constant flux, that nothing remains the same, that even empires rise and fall. He knew that the peace and prosperity of Antoninus's reign could not last forever. And in the back of his mind, he must have dreaded the day when Antoninus would die, and he would be forced to take up the burden he had never wanted. That day came on March 7th, 161 CE. Antoninus Pius, after a brief illness, died at his country estate. He was 74 years old and had ruled for nearly a quarter century. The transition was smooth. Marcus was 40 years old, healthy, well-prepared, and respected throughout the empire. But what he did next surprised everyone and revealed much about his character. Chapter 5. The Philosopher Takes the Throne. The Senate immediately moved to acclaim Marcus as the sole emperor. This was the obvious course, the expected course. Marcus was Antoninus's adopted son and designated heir. He had been trained for this role his entire adult life. But Marcus refused to accept sole power. He insisted that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, the son of that first failed heir, Lucius Aelius Caesar, should rule as co-emperor with equal authority. The Senate was taken aback. Co-emperorship was virtually unknown in Roman history. There had been brief periods where two emperors ruled different parts of the empire, but never had there been two men with equal power sharing the throne from Rome itself. Why did Marcus do this? Some historians speculate that it was conscience, that Marcus believed this had been Hadrian's original plan all along, that both he and Lucius were meant to rule together. Others suggest it was simply Marcus's sense of fairness and justice, his refusal to cast aside his adoptive brother for the sake of sole power. Whatever the reason, the Senate agreed. Marcus became Imperator Caesar, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. Lucius became Imperator Caesar, Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus. The two emperors, the philosopher and the soldier, would rule Rome together. They could hardly have been more different. Marcus was serious, studious, devoted to philosophy and duty. Lucius was charming, pleasure-loving, more interested in the circus and the hunt than in governance. Yet the arrangement seems to have worked, largely because Marcus bore the administrative burden while Lucius served as the public face of the military. In official documents and coins, both names appeared. Both were given the same titles and honors. But everyone understood that Marcus was the senior partner, that the real power rested with the philosopher-emperor. Almost immediately, the new emperors faced a crisis that would test their resolve and reveal the challenges of their joint reign. In the east, the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival, launched an invasion of Armenia. This was no minor border skirmish. Armenia was a buffer state between the two empires, a mountainous kingdom that both Rome and Parthia had tried to control for generations. Its strategic importance was immense. Whoever controlled Armenia controlled the routes between east and west, the trade roads that brought silk from China and spices from India. King Vologases, the fourth of Parthia, seeing an opportunity in Rome's imperial transition, installed his own candidate on the Armenian throne and sent armies into the Roman province of Syria. Roman garrisons were defeated. Roman allies were threatened. The governor of Syria sent urgent dispatches to Rome reporting the crisis. This was a direct challenge to Roman authority that could not be ignored. If Rome failed to respond, the entire eastern frontier would be at risk. Client kingdoms would question Rome's power. Provinces might rebel. The prestige of the empire would be shattered. Lucius Verus was sent east to take command of the Roman response. This suited everyone perfectly. Lucius, who had spent his life preparing for military glory rather than philosophical contemplation, was given the chance to prove himself in war. Marcus, whose talents lay in administration and governance rather than battlefield command, remained in Rome to manage the empire. The division of labor seemed natural and practical. Lucius departed in 162 CE with considerable fanfare, accompanied by legions recalled from other frontiers and supplied with everything needed for a major campaign. But it would be his generals, particularly a capable and ambitious officer named Avidius Cassius, who would actually win the war. Cassius was a rising star, the son of a low-ranking senator from Syria, who had proven himself an exceptional commander. Under his leadership, the Roman legions launched a devastating counteroffensive. They crossed the Euphrates, invaded Mesopotamia, and laid siege to the great Parthian cities. Seleucia, one of the largest cities in the east, fell to Roman assault in 165 CE. The soldiers sacked the city thoroughly, carrying away vast quantities of treasure. Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital itself, was captured and looted. The Parthian king fled. His armies were scattered. By 166 CE, the war was essentially won. Armenia was back under Roman influence, with a king acceptable to Rome installed on its throne. Mesopotamia had been ravaged. Parthia had been humbled and would not threaten Rome's eastern provinces for years to come. Both emperors took the victory title Armeniacus, conqueror of Armenia, and Lucius was specifically hailed as Parthicus Maximus, greatest victor over Parthia. Triumphal arches were planned in Rome. Coins were struck celebrating the victory. It seemed like a glorious success, the kind of military achievement that Romans expected from their emperors. But the returning armies brought back something far more deadly than enemy swords, something that would make the victory seem hollow in retrospect. But the returning armies brought back something far more deadly than enemy swords. Soldiers who had looted the Mesopotamian cities, who had torn through houses and temples searching for treasure, carried with them a disease that would become known as the Antonine Plague. The disease probably originated somewhere in the east, perhaps in the cities along the Euphrates, perhaps brought by trade caravans from even further afield. It spread with terrifying speed. From the returning legions, it moved to the military camps, then to the cities of the eastern provinces, then westward along the roads and shipping lanes that connected the empire. Within months, the entire Roman world was engulfed. The symptoms were horrifying. High fever that lasted for days, terrible diarrhea that left victims dehydrated and weak, pustules and sores that erupted across the skin, covering the body in black and red lesions. Some victims became delirious. Many died within a week of showing symptoms. The death toll was catastrophic. Modern estimates suggest 5 to 10 million deaths over the course of 15 years, perhaps 7 to 10% of the empire's entire population. To put this in perspective, imagine every 10th person you know simply dying over the course of a decade and a half. Families were decimated. Entire villages were wiped out. In the cities, the situation was even worse due to crowding and poor sanitation. At its height, sources speak of 2,000 people dying per day in Rome alone. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The traditional Roman funeral rites, elaborate affairs that honored the dead and comforted the living, became impossible. Mass graves were dug outside the cities. Funeral pyres burned day and night, filling the air with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. The social fabric began to fray. People abandoned their sick family members out of fear. Physicians fled the cities. Markets closed as farmers refused to bring their goods into plague-stricken areas. The economy contracted sharply. Tax revenues plummeted as taxpayers died or fled. The army, already engaged in warfare on multiple frontiers, lost thousands of soldiers to disease. Recruitment became difficult as young men who would normally have joined the legions were dead or too weak from illness. Marcus's physician, the famous Galen, one of the most brilliant medical minds of the ancient world, observed and described the symptoms in detail. He wrote about the skin eruptions, the fever patterns, the progression of the disease. But for all his knowledge, he had no cure. No treatment worked. Bloodletting, the standard Roman medical response to fever, only weakened patients further. Herbal remedies had no effect. Prayer and sacrifice to the gods seemed equally futile. People died by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Marcus faced the crisis with characteristic Stoic resolve. He did not flee Rome as some suggested. He organized relief efforts, distributed grain to the starving, sold imperial treasures to fund public aid, and maintained government functions even as the bureaucracy was decimated. He wrote in his private journal that external events cannot truly harm us, that only our own vices can corrupt our character, that we must accept what we cannot control and focus on what we can, our own virtue and duty. Chapter 6. The Northern Storm. As if the plague were not enough, disaster struck from another direction. In 166 CE, even as the Parthian War was ending, Germanic tribes crossed the Danube frontier in force. The Marcomanni and the Quadi, tribes that had lived beyond Rome's northern borders for generations, invaded the provinces of Pannonia and Noricum. For the first time in centuries, barbarian armies penetrated deep into Roman territory. They even reached the northern shores of the Adriatic Sea, threatening Italy itself. The crisis was unprecedented in living memory. Rome had not faced such danger on its own borders since the Cimbri and Teutones threatened the city over 250 years before. The army that should have defended the frontier had been weakened by the plague. Legions were under strength, recruitment was difficult, and experienced officers were dying. Marcus and Lucius were forced to take emergency measures. They recruited gladiators, slaves, and bandits, anyone who could hold a sword. They auctioned off imperial property to raise funds for the war. They postponed planned building projects and cut government spending. In 167 CE, the two emperors personally traveled north to the Danube frontier. This was unusual for Marcus, who had never been on a military campaign. His entire life had been spent in Rome, or in the comfortable villas of the Italian countryside. Now he found himself in military camps, sleeping in tents, eating soldiers' rations, and planning campaigns against fierce warriors who knew no fear of Rome's ancient glory. The military headquarters was established at Carnuntum, a fortress city on the Danube in the province of Pannonia. Here, Marcus would spend much of the next 14 years of his life. The war against the Germanic tribes would consume the rest of his reign. The campaign of 167 turned to disaster when plague struck the army camps. Thousands of soldiers died, including, possibly, Lucius Verus. In January of 169 CE, while the emperors were returning to Italy for the winter, Lucius suffered a stroke and died. He was 38 years old. Some sources suggest the plague killed him, others that it was apoplexy or poison, but the most likely explanation is simply that he had a cerebral hemorrhage. Marcus was now sole emperor, exactly what he had refused to be 8 years earlier. He grieved for his adoptive brother, but he could not pause. The northern frontier was in flames. In 169 and 170 CE, Marcus threw himself into the war with grim determination. This was not the life he had wanted. He was not a warrior emperor like Trajan or a military genius like Julius Caesar. He was a philosopher who loved his books and his quiet moments of reflection. But duty demanded that he fight, and so he fought. The war was brutal and exhausting. The Germanic tribes were not a unified enemy with whom Rome could negotiate a peace. They were dozens of separate peoples, each with their own leaders and motivations. Victory against one group simply meant another would test the frontier elsewhere. Marcus established his command post at Carnuntum and spent 3 continuous years there, from 171 to 173 CE, directing operations, reinforcing the frontier, and slowly pushing the invaders back across the Danube. He proved to be a surprisingly capable commander, or at least, he was wise enough to trust his generals and brave enough to share the hardships of the common soldier. The legions loved him for it. Unlike emperors who commanded from comfortable distance, Marcus lived in the camps, shared the dangers, and showed that he took his duty seriously. During these years, something else happened. In the cold nights on the Danube, by the light of oil lamps in his military tent, Marcus began to write. Not reports or dispatches, but a personal journal in Greek, reminders to himself of Stoic teachings and how to apply them to his life. Chapter 7. Meditations in Wartime. Marcus called these private writings to himself, or perhaps they had no title at all. We know them as the Meditations, a title given by later editors. They were never meant for publication. They were not polished philosophical treatises or public declarations. They were a soldier's journal, an emperor's private conversation with himself, reminders of principles he struggled to live by. The Meditations are unlike any other ancient text. They are repetitive, sometimes disorganized, jumping from topic to topic as Marcus's thoughts wandered. But that very quality makes them powerful. These are not the words of a man who has achieved perfect wisdom, but of a man struggling, day by day, to improve himself. When you wake up in the morning, Marcus wrote to himself, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. Here was an emperor reminding himself to be patient with difficult people, to recognize their common humanity, to refuse to let their behavior disturb his own peace of mind. "You could leave life right now," he wrote. "Let that determine what you do and say and think." This was not morbid pessimism, but Stoic realism. Death could come at any moment, from disease, from an assassin's blade, from accident. Therefore, every action should be performed as if it might be your last. Do not waste time on trivialities. Do not put off virtue until tomorrow. Live now according to your principles, because there may be no later. Throughout the meditations, certain themes recur: the shortness of life and the inevitability of death, the importance of focusing on what is in your control and accepting what is not, the unity of all rational beings and the duty to treat others justly, the worthlessness of fame and reputation compared to genuine virtue. But the meditations also reveal Marcus's struggles. He was not a man who found Stoic detachment easy. He was frustrated by incompetent officials. He was tired of the endless meetings and administrative drudgery. He was irritated by the petty concerns of courtiers. He was lonely, missing his family, longing for the philosophical life he had given up to serve as emperor. "In the morning, when you have trouble getting out of bed," he wrote, "tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I am going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do?" This is not the voice of someone who loves his work. It is the voice of someone reminding himself of duty, talking himself into doing what must be done. The meditations show us an emperor who was also a human being, who faced the same struggles we do, who had to remind himself again and again of the same lessons because he kept forgetting them. Perhaps this is why the meditations have endured for nearly 2,000 years. They speak not from the heights of achieved wisdom, but from the trenches of daily struggle. Marcus never published these thoughts. They were his private journal, a tool for self-improvement. But somehow they survived his death, were copied by scribes, passed down through the centuries. They were not widely known in the ancient world, but in the Renaissance, they were rediscovered, translated, and read by kings and commoners alike. Today, they remain one of the most widely read philosophy texts in the world. Econ Chapter 8, Victory and Betrayal. By 173 CE, Marcus had achieved significant success against the Germanic tribes. The Marcomanni and Quadi, who had seemed unstoppable just a few years before, had been driven back across the Danube. Roman authority was restored in the provinces of Pannonia and Noricum. The frontier fortifications had been rebuilt and strengthened. New legionary camps dotted the Danube, permanent bases from which Rome could project power northward. Marcus even entertained the idea of creating new provinces north of the Danube, extending Roman civilization deeper into Germanic territory, as Trajan had done in Dacia nearly 70 years before. It was an ambitious plan that would require years to implement, but it seemed achievable. The tribes were weakened, the army was strong, the frontier was secure. But then came news from the east that stunned the empire and personally wounded Marcus more deeply than any barbarian sword could have. Avidius Cassius, the general who had won the Parthian War for Lucius Verus, who now governed Syria and commanded all the eastern legions, who had been rewarded with honors and trust by Marcus himself, had declared himself emperor. The revolt of Cassius in 175 CE was based on a false rumor, or so Cassius claimed later. Someone had spread the news that Marcus was dead or dying on the Danube frontier. Given the plague and the constant warfare, this was not an implausible rumor. Marcus was not a young man anymore. He was in his 50s and had never been robust. Cassius, ambitious and extremely popular with his troops who remembered his victories over the Parthians, seized what he saw as an opportunity. He proclaimed himself emperor, declaring that Rome needed strong leadership and that he would provide it. The eastern provinces, including the vital grain-producing province of Egypt, recognized his claim. Egypt's grain fed Rome itself, so its defection was particularly serious. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might split, with Cassius controlling the wealthy east and Marcus holding the west and north. Civil war loomed, the nightmare that had torn the empire apart multiple times in the past and could do so again. When Marcus learned of the rebellion, he was devastated. Not primarily because of the political danger, though that was real enough. Civil war had torn the empire apart before, most recently during the Year of the Four Emperors, a century earlier, when Rome had burned and legions had fought each other while the Germanic tribes raided unopposed. It could happen again, and this time the empire might not survive. But Marcus was hurt personally, wounded in his soul. He had trusted Cassius, had given him command and honor, had relied on him to secure the eastern frontier, while Marcus himself fought in the north. Now the man had betrayed him, had taken advantage of a false rumor to seize power. Yet even in his anger and disappointment, Marcus's Stoic principles guided his response. He wrote to the Senate asking them not to execute Cassius's family if the rebellion failed. He said he would prefer to forgive Cassius himself and bring him back into the fold rather than have the man killed. He spoke of the tragedy of civil war, of Romans killing Romans, of legions that should be defending the empire instead turning their swords on each other. He expressed his hope that bloodshed could be avoided, that reason and mercy might prevail. This was remarkable. Roman emperors typically responded to treason with savage reprisals. Entire families were executed. Supporters were hunted down and killed or exiled. Prescription lists were posted naming those to be murdered and their property confiscated. It was brutal and effective at discouraging future rebellion. But Marcus wanted none of it. In the end, it did not matter. Before Marcus could even march east, Cassius was assassinated by his own officers. They brought his severed head to Marcus as proof of their loyalty. Marcus refused to look at it. He ordered it buried with honor and declared a general amnesty for those who had supported the rebellion. He did execute Cassius's closest co-conspirators, those who had actively planned the revolt, but he spared the general's family and most of his supporters. This clemency was unusual. Roman emperors typically responded to treason with mass executions, proscriptions, and confiscations. Marcus's mercy was noted and praised, though some saw it as weakness. With the Eastern crisis resolved, Marcus decided to tour the eastern provinces personally. He took Faustina and his son Commodus, now 13 years old, with him. It was a chance to show imperial favor to the provinces that had briefly supported a usurper, to reassure them of Marcus's continued rule, and perhaps for Marcus to see the lands where he had sent Lucius to war years before. The imperial family traveled through Asia Minor, visiting cities, hearing petitions, and displaying the majesty of Rome. But in the summer of 175 CE, disaster struck. Faustina died suddenly in a military camp at the base of the Taurus Mountains in Cappadocia. She was perhaps 45 years old. The cause of death is unknown. Ancient sources hint at various possibilities: illness, accident, even suicide, though the latter seems unlikely. Marcus was grief-stricken. For 30 years, Faustina had been his wife, the mother of his children, his companion through joy and sorrow. Despite ancient rumors of her infidelity, rumors that Marcus almost certainly did not believe, he honored her memory deeply. He had her deified, declared a goddess by the Senate, a rare honor. He founded a charity for orphaned girls in her name. And in his meditations, he thanked the gods for giving him such a wife, obedient, affectionate, and loving. With Faustina's death, Marcus lost one of the few personal comforts he had left. Chapter 9. The Long War continues. Marcus returned to Rome after Faustina's death, but he could not stay. The northern frontier was again in turmoil. The Germanic tribes, though defeated, were not destroyed. New generations of warriors were growing up beyond the Danube, and the pressure on Rome's borders was relentless. In 177 CE, Marcus made a decision that would have profound consequences for Rome's future. He elevated his son Commodus, now 15 years old, to the rank of co-emperor, giving him the title Augustus and full imperial powers. This was the first time in over a century that a Roman emperor had been succeeded by his biological son. Since the Emperor Vespasian in the late 1st century, every emperor had chosen his successor by adoption, selecting the most capable man available rather than relying on blood lineage. Marcus has been criticized for this decision ever since. Commodus would prove to be one of Rome's worst emperors, vain, cruel, and incompetent. His reign would end the Pax Romana and plunge Rome into a period of chaos known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Did Marcus not see what his son was becoming? Did he hope that responsibility would mature the young man? Or did he simply feel that blood duty, the obligation to his own son, outweighed political wisdom? We cannot know. What we know is that Marcus, despite all his philosophy and wisdom, chose family over merit. Perhaps even philosopher-emperors are not immune to a father's love and hope for his child. In 178 CE, Marcus and Commodus returned to the northern frontier together. The war against the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other Germanic tribes had resumed. Marcus established his headquarters once again on the Danube, this time at Vindobona, the military camp that would one day become Vienna. The emperor was now 57 years old, and his health was failing. He had never been robust. Ancient sources speak of his weak chest, his stomach problems, possibly an ulcer that caused him chronic pain. The hard life of military campaigns, the cold winters on the frontier, the stress of constant warfare, all were taking their toll. Yet Marcus continued to lead. He planned campaigns, reinforced fortifications, negotiated with tribal leaders, and slowly pushed Rome's enemies back. He seems to have genuinely believed that he could create a lasting peace on the northern frontier by expanding Roman control beyond the Danube, creating new provinces that would serve as buffers against tribes further north. It was an ambitious plan, and it might have worked, but it required time, resources, and most of all, a successor who would continue the policy. Commodus was not that successor. The young co-emperor had no interest in the grim work of frontier warfare. He wanted to return to Rome, to the pleasures of the circus and the adulation of the crowds. He endured the campaigns because his father required it, but his heart was not in it. Marcus must have known this. He must have seen that Commodus lacked his dedication, his sense of duty, his philosophical temperament. Yet what could he do? Commodus was his son, his only surviving son. To pass him over would invite civil war. Some successor would claim the throne, and Commodus's supporters, and there would be supporters, would fight for him. Better to prepare Commodus as best he could and hope that maturity and responsibility would transform the boy into a man worthy of the purple. It was a gamble that would fail spectacularly, but we must not judge Marcus too harshly for it. He was human, and the love of a father for his son is one of the most human emotions of all. Chapter 10. The Gathering Darkness. The winter of 179 to 180 CE was particularly harsh on the Danube. The military camps were cold and damp, disease was rampant, and the mood was grim. The war had gone on for so long that even the soldiers were weary. They had won battles, pushed back the tribes, secured the frontier time and again, but the enemy always returned. It seemed endless, a struggle that would never truly be won. Marcus felt the weight of it all. In his tent at night, he continued to write in his journal, but now his thoughts turned more often to death. Not with fear or regret, but with a kind of weary acceptance. "Do not despise death," he wrote, "but welcome it, for nature wills it like all else. For it is natural to grow old and to die. Like youth and maturity, old age also arrives in its proper season." He reminded himself that death was simply a part of the natural order, no more to be feared than sleep. "Soon you will be ash or bones, a mere name, if even that. And a name is just sound and echo. The things we pursue in life are empty, rotten, trivial. People are puppies snapping at each other, children quarreling, laughing, then weeping moments after." These were not the words of a depressed man, but of a Stoic preparing himself for what he knew was coming. Marcus was dying. Whether from the plague that had ravaged the empire for 15 years, or from the chronic illnesses that had afflicted him all his life, or simply from exhaustion, his body was failing. The ancient historians disagree on the details. Some say it was plague, others suggest natural causes, still others, more sensationally, hint at poison administered by Commodus or his advisors, though this seems unlikely. What is certain is that in early March of 180 CE, Marcus's condition worsened rapidly. He developed a high fever. He could not eat. He was weak and in pain. He knew he was dying. On March 17th, 180 CE, Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, philosopher-king, and the last of the five good emperors, died. He was 58 years old. He had ruled for 19 years, much of it spent in military camps far from the comforts of Rome, fighting wars he never wanted, bearing burdens he never sought, doing his duty until the very end. The ancient historian Cassius Dio, who lived during Marcus's reign, recorded his last words. A military tribune came to ask for the watchword, the password that would authenticate orders in the camp. Marcus, lying on his deathbed, unable even to speak clearly, whispered, "Look to the rising sun, for I am already setting." Then he turned his face away, drew his cloak over his head, and died. It was a stoic death, accepting, serene, and dignified. The army mourned him. The Senate deified him. His ashes were returned to Rome and placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian alongside the ashes of his predecessors. A column was erected in Rome to commemorate his victories over the Germanic tribes, standing to this day. He was called the philosopher by contemporaries and by history. He was praised for his clemency, his justice, his dedication to duty. But did he succeed? Chapter 11. The Empire Mourns. News of Marcus Aurelius's death spread through the Roman Empire like a tremor, carried by messengers on fast horses, by ships crossing the Mediterranean, by word of mouth through cities and villages. In Rome, the Senate convened an emergency session to honor the fallen emperor. They voted him all the traditional honors of a deceased ruler and more. A state funeral with all the pomp Rome could muster. A temple for his worship to be built on the Campus Martius. Priests to tend his cult and perform the rituals that would maintain his divine favor. Annual games held in his memory, gladiatorial combats and chariot races that would celebrate his reign. Statues to be erected in every major city of the empire. His name to be included in the prayers and oaths of magistrates. All the formal recognition that Roman custom prescribed for great emperors. But more than the formalities, there was genuine grief rippling through the population. Marcus had been beloved, in a way few emperors were. He had not been a tyrant who ruled by fear, executing senators on a whim and confiscating their property. He had not been a distant, godlike figure who appeared only for staged ceremonies and never showed human emotion. He had not been a wastrel who emptied the treasury on personal pleasures while the people starved. He had been, in the eyes of his contemporaries, a good man trying his best to rule justly in difficult times. A man who worked long hours hearing legal cases to ensure justice was done. A man who auctioned imperial treasures to feed the hungry during the plague. A man who lived in military camps on the frontier, sharing the hardships of his soldiers when he could have remained in the luxurious palaces of Rome. The common people of Rome mourned him, gathering in the forum and temples to make offerings and prayers. The soldiers on the frontiers, particularly those who had served under him on the Danube, mourned him deeply. They had seen him in the camps, had watched him endure the cold and danger, had heard him address them not with empty promises of glory, but with honest talk about duty and necessity. They knew he had not wanted to be there, that he could have delegated command to his generals and remained in comfort, but he had stayed because he believed a commander's place was with his troops. The provincial cities throughout the empire, from Britain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt, mourned him as well. Under Marcus, the provinces had been governed justly, their petitions heard, their grievances addressed. Local notables remembered meeting him during his tours, remembered his patience in listening to their concerns, his willingness to overturn unjust decisions by local governors. Even the Senate, that body of aristocrats who so often clashed with strong emperors over matters of prestige and power, recognized that they had lost something rare. Marcus had respected senatorial privilege, had consulted the Senate on major decisions, even though he did not have to, had treated senators as partners in governance rather than as subjects to be commanded. He had not executed senators for imagined plots or confiscated their estates to fund his wars. He had been what Romans called a bonus imperator, a good emperor, perhaps the last good emperor Rome would ever know. The philosopher Cassius Dio, writing a few decades later, would say of Marcus that he did not have the good fortune he deserved, for he was not strong in body and was involved in troubles throughout his entire reign. But for this very reason, Dio admired him all the more, that amid unusual and extraordinary difficulties, he both survived himself and preserved the empire. Marcus's body was brought back from the Danube frontier to Rome with all the ceremony due an emperor. The journey took weeks, the funeral cortege moving slowly through the provinces, each city turning out to honor the passing emperor. When the procession finally reached Rome, The entire city came out to witness it. The funeral was held with full imperial honors. Marcus's body was cremated, as was Roman custom, and his ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, the massive circular tomb on the banks of the Tiber that housed the remains of Rome's emperors. Later ages would convert it into a fortress, then a castle, and it stands today as the Castel Sant'Angelo, one of Rome's most recognizable landmarks. The Senate officially deified Marcus, declaring him a god to be worshipped alongside Jupiter, Mars, and the other deities of the Roman pantheon. Temples were built, priests were appointed, and sacrifices were offered to Divus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. This was standard practice for respected emperors, but in Marcus's case, there seems to have been genuine popular support for his cult. He was not deified merely because protocol demanded it, but because people actually wanted to honor his memory. Statues of Marcus were erected throughout the empire. The most famous, an equestrian statue showing Marcus on horseback, was placed in front of the imperial palace in Rome. It survives today, the only equestrian statue of a Roman emperor to survive the fall of Rome intact. For centuries it stood in a piazza in Rome because medieval Christians believed it depicted Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and therefore did not melt it down. But the most lasting memorial to Marcus would be something he never intended as a memorial at all. Somewhere in the chaos following his death, someone preserved his private journals, those notes he had written to himself in Greek during the long years on the Danube frontier. We do not know who saved them or how they were passed down. They were not widely circulated in antiquity. Only a few ancient writers mention them. But somehow, through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, through the Dark Ages, through countless wars and upheavals, a copy survived. In the Byzantine Empire, scholars read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and recognized their value. Chapter 12. Commodus takes power. Even as Rome mourned Marcus, the empire had to move forward. There was no question of the succession. Commodus had been co-emperor for 3 years. He was young, only 18 years old, but he was the legitimate heir. The army acclaimed him. The Senate confirmed him. There were no rivals, no pretenders. The transition was smooth, but it was also the beginning of the end of everything Marcus had worked for. Commodus was not his father. Where Marcus had been serious and duty-bound, Commodus was frivolous and self-indulgent. Where Marcus had studied philosophy and worked tirelessly at governance, Commodus preferred gladiatorial games and personal pleasure. Almost immediately, Commodus made a decision that reversed his father's policy. He ended the war on the northern frontier. Marcus had been planning to create new provinces north of the Danube, to extend Roman control and create a lasting peace. Commodus abandoned this plan. He negotiated a hasty peace with the Germanic tribes, making concessions that his father would never have allowed, and then he left the frontier and returned to Rome. He wanted no more of the cold camps and hard campaigning. He wanted the luxuries of the capital, the adulation of the crowds, the entertainments of the circus. The army was shocked and disappointed. The generals who had fought beside Marcus for years saw all their victories thrown away. But Commodus did not care. In Rome, Commodus's reign quickly descended into madness. He became obsessed with gladiatorial combat, insisting on fighting in the arena himself. This was scandalous beyond measure. Gladiators were slaves, criminals, the lowest of the low in Roman society. For an emperor to dress as a gladiator and fight in the arena was an outrage to Roman dignity. But Commodus did it repeatedly, fighting bears, lions, and criminals, always winning because his opponents were terrified to hurt him. He renamed Rome itself after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. He executed senators on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The Senate that had loved Marcus now lived in terror of his son. Where was the philosopher-emperor's teaching? How had the son of Marcus Aurelius turned into a monster? Some blamed Marcus for elevating his biological son instead of adopting a worthy successor as his predecessors had done. Others suggested that Commodus's mother, Faustina, had been unfaithful, that Commodus was not really Marcus's son at all, though this was almost certainly slander. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. Commodus had been raised in luxury, given everything he wanted, and told from childhood that he would be emperor. He had never been forced to struggle, never had to prove himself, never developed the character that comes from hardship and self-discipline. Marcus had tried to educate him in philosophy, but you cannot force wisdom on someone who does not want it. Commodus wanted power, pleasure, and glory, not virtue and self-mastery. In 192 CE, 12 years after Marcus's death, Commodus was strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner Narcissus, acting on behalf of a conspiracy of palace officials who could no longer tolerate his madness. The Senate declared him a public enemy and had his statues torn down. The Nerva Antonine dynasty, the line of the 5 good emperors, ended not with dignity, but with ignominy. The year 193 CE would see 5 different men claim the imperial throne. Civil war broke out. The Pax Romana was over. The period of relative peace and stability that had lasted since Augustus, almost 2 centuries, came to an end. Chapter 13. The Legacy of a Philosopher. In the chaos that followed Commodus's death and the civil wars that erupted throughout the empire, it would have been easy for Marcus Aurelius to be forgotten, overshadowed by his son's infamy and the disasters that came after. But that is not what happened. Marcus's memory remained bright. The Senate, when they condemned Commodus, explicitly declared that the son was not worthy of the father. Marcus was still honored as Divus Marcus, the divine Marcus, a god and a model of imperial virtue. Historians writing in the following centuries consistently praised Marcus as the last of the good emperors, the final exemplar of what a Roman ruler should be. The Greek historian Cassius Dio, who had lived through both Marcus's and Commodus's reigns, wrote with admiration of the philosopher-emperor. He acknowledged that Marcus had not had good fortune, that his reign had been troubled by plague and war, but he praised Marcus's character, his patience, his justice, and his endurance. Later Christian historians, despite Marcus's enforcement of laws against Christianity, also spoke well of him. Justin Martyr and Athenagoras both called him the philosopher, and even Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, called Marcus more philanthropic and philosophic than his predecessors. This was extraordinary for Christians to praise an emperor who had persecuted them. The truth about Marcus and Christianity is complex. Christians were persecuted during his reign, there is no doubt of that. Christians were executed in Lyon, in Gaul, in Rome, and in other cities. But it is unclear how much of this was Marcus's doing. Roman law made Christianity illegal because Christians refused to participate in the imperial cult, refused to offer even token sacrifices to the emperor's genius. This was seen as treason, a rejection of Roman society itself. Local governors enforced these laws, often at the urging of angry mobs. Marcus, as emperor, did not stop these persecutions, and he enforced the existing laws, but he does not seem to have initiated any empire-wide campaign against Christians. His own philosophy would have seen Christianity as a superstition, an irrational belief that placed personal salvation above civic duty. Yet his Stoic principles also taught him to treat all people justly, even those whose beliefs he rejected. The paradox of Marcus Aurelius is that he could be both a persecutor of Christians and a man of genuine virtue, both a philosopher of mercy and a ruler who allowed executions. He was not perfect. He was a man of his time, with all the prejudices and blind spots that entailed. But he tried, harder than most, to live according to his principles. For that, even his enemies gave him a measure of respect. As the Roman Empire declined and fell in the West, Marcus's memory persisted. In the Byzantine Empire, scholars preserved his writings. In the Islamic world, philosophers knew of him. Chapter 14. Stoicism Reborn. Why has Marcus Aurelius, and Stoicism more broadly, become so popular in the 21st century? Part of the answer lies in the nature of our age and the particular anxieties it produces. We live in a time of rapid change, where technologies transform society faster than we can adapt, where the pace of life accelerates constantly, where we are connected to everyone yet often feel isolated. We face constant information overload, our phones buzzing with notifications, news feeds updating with crises from around the world, social media bombarding us with curated images of other people's seemingly perfect lives. We experience widespread anxiety about the future, about climate change, political instability, economic uncertainty, technological displacement, traditional sources of meaning and stability, religious institutions that once provided community and moral guidance, local communities where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another, stable, careers where you could work for one company for 40 years and retire with a pension. All of these have weakened or disappeared. People are searching, often desperately, for philosophies that can help them navigate uncertainty, maintain peace of mind in chaos, and find meaning in a world that often seems meaningless. Stoicism offers practical tools for doing exactly that, tools that are not dependent on religious faith or political ideology, tools that can be applied by anyone regardless of their background or circumstances. The Stoics teach you to focus on what you can control and accept what you cannot. This is powerfully liberating in an age where we are constantly bombarded with news of crises we cannot personally solve. You cannot stop climate change single-handedly. You cannot prevent wars in distant countries. You cannot control what other people think of you or what they post on social media. But you can control your own thoughts, your own actions, your own responses. You can control whether you act with integrity, whether you treat others with kindness, whether you do your best in your own sphere of influence. This shift in focus from the external to the internal is psychologically liberating. The Stoics teach that external things, wealth, status, physical beauty, even health and life itself, are not what make us happy or unhappy. What makes us happy is our own virtue, our own character, the quality of our thoughts and intentions. This resonates powerfully with people who feel trapped on treadmills of material acquisition and status seeking. You work long hours to buy things you do not need, to impress people you do not like, to achieve status that feels hollow once attained. Stoicism says you are chasing the wrong things. True happiness comes not from external success, but from internal virtue, from being a good person, from acting with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control. No one can take that away from you. Your character is the one thing that is entirely in your power. The Stoics teach that negative emotions, anxiety, anger, grief, jealousy, come not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. This is a revolutionary insight. It means you are not a helpless victim of your emotions, tossed about by circumstances beyond your control. You can change how you feel by changing how you think about what happens to you. Someone insults you, and you feel angry, but the insult itself did not create the anger. Your judgment that you have been wronged, that your honor has been diminished, that you must defend yourself, those judgments created the anger. Change the judgments. Recognize that another person's opinion cannot actually harm you, and the anger dissolves. This insight has been validated by modern cognitive behavioral therapy, which is directly inspired by Stoic principles and has helped millions of people. The connection between ancient Stoicism and modern psychology is not accidental. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, the pioneers of cognitive behavioral therapy in the mid-20th century, explicitly acknowledged their debt to Stoic philosophers, particularly Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. The Stoic idea that our thoughts shape our emotions, that by changing our thinking we can change how we feel, became the cornerstone of CBT. Today, CBT is one of the most effective treatments for depression, anxiety, and many other psychological problems. Millions of people have been helped by therapeutic techniques derived from the same philosophy that Marcus Aurelius practiced 19 centuries ago. Beyond psychology, Stoicism has found audiences in business, military, athletics, and many other fields. Leaders appreciate Stoic teachings about responsibility, about making the best decision you can with available information, and then accepting the outcome without regret. Athletes appreciate Stoic techniques for maintaining focus under pressure and dealing with defeat. Soldiers and first responders appreciate Stoic practices for managing fear and stress in dangerous situations. And ordinary people appreciate the Stoic reminder that you do not need wealth, fame, or perfect circumstances to live a good life. You only need to cultivate your own character. Marcus Aurelius has become the face of modern Stoicism. His image, usually the famous equestrian statue or ancient busts, appears on countless book covers, websites, and motivational posters. His quotes are shared on social media by millions. He has become a symbol of philosophical wisdom applied to real life, of power wielded with restraint, of a man who did his duty without complaint, even when duty was burdensome. Of course, there is a danger in this popular appropriation of Marcus Aurelius. It is easy to turn him into a simple, motivational figure, to reduce his philosophy to bite-sized quotes divorced from their context. The real Marcus was more complex than the idealized version often presented. He was a man of his time, a Roman aristocrat who accepted slavery as natural, who waged brutal wars, who enforced laws that persecuted religious minorities. He was not, despite his philosophy, able to see beyond all the prejudices of his culture. Yet even acknowledging these limitations, there is something genuinely admirable about Marcus Aurelius. He tried, harder than most people in positions of absolute power, to be good. He held himself to high standards. He questioned himself constantly. He never pretended to have achieved wisdom, only to be striving for it. Chapter 15, The Final Journey. Let us return to that military camp on the Danube in March of 180 CE. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome for 19 years, is dying. He has lived 58 years, seen more of life's sorrows and burdens than most men ever face. He has lost his father as a small child, his adoptive father Antoninus, his co-emperor Lucius, his wife Faustina, many of his children. He has witnessed plague kill millions of his subjects. He has fought a seemingly endless war on the northern frontier. He has faced betrayal by a trusted general. He has carried the weight of ruling an empire through crisis after crisis. And through it all, he has tried to live according to his principles, to be just, merciful, and dutiful. Now, in his final days, he seems at peace. The Stoic philosophy he has practiced his entire adult life has prepared him for this moment. Death, he has written again and again, is nothing to fear. It is a natural process, a return to the elements, a necessary part of the cosmic cycle. To fear death is as irrational as to fear going to sleep. He summons his son Commodus to his bedside. What did they say to each other in those final conversations? Ancient sources give us only fragments and rumors. Some say Marcus urged Commodus to continue the war, to complete the conquest he had begun. Others say he spoke of virtue and duty. Still others claim he warned Commodus of the dangers of power. We do not know the truth. On the night of March 16th, Marcus's fever worsened. He knew the end was near. He refused food and drink, a traditional Roman way of hastening death once it was inevitable. He gave orders for Commodus to be sent away from his tent, either to protect his son from the plague, if that was what afflicted him, or simply to spare the young man the sight of his father's death. Alone with his attendants and bodyguards, Marcus faced his final hours. The military tribune on duty came to ask for the watchword, the password that would authenticate orders throughout the camp that night. Marcus, barely able to speak, weak and exhausted, gave his final words. "Look to the rising sun, for I am already setting." It was perfect. The rising sun was Commodus, the new emperor, the future of Rome. The setting sun was Marcus himself, his light fading after a long day. There was no fear in those words, no regret, only acceptance and a practical concern for the transition of power. After the tribune left, Marcus turned his face to the wall, pulled his cloak over his head, and waited for death. It came quietly in the early hours of March 17th. The soldiers in the camp learned of his death at dawn. There was no panic, no chaos. Marcus had prepared for this moment. Commodus was already recognized as co-emperor. The succession was secure. But there was profound grief. The legions had loved Marcus. He had shared their hardships, lived in the camps, endured the cold and danger alongside them. They knew he had not wanted to be there, that he could have remained in Rome in comfort and luxury, but he had stayed because duty required it. The officers began preparations to transport Marcus's body back to Rome. It would take weeks, moving slowly through the provinces, with ceremonies at each major city. Meanwhile, Commodus took command. His first act was to negotiate peace with the Germanic tribes and announce his intention to return to Rome. The generals who had served under Marcus watched in dismay, but they were powerless to stop him. The new emperor had spoken. When Marcus's body finally reached Rome, the entire city turned out. The funeral was held with all the traditional pomp and ceremony of an imperial burial. Senators gave eulogies. Soldiers marched in procession. Incense burned and trumpets sounded. Marcus's body was cremated on a massive pyre in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars where Roman military triumphs had been celebrated for centuries. His ashes were collected and placed in a golden urn, then taken to the mausoleum of Hadrian to rest alongside the emperors who had come before him. The Senate voted the usual honors. Marcus was declared Divus Marcus, a god to be worshipped. Temples were dedicated to him. Priests were appointed to his cult. A column was erected in Rome, its surface carved with scenes from his Germanic wars, showing Roman soldiers fighting barbarians, Marcus addressing his troops, victories, and triumphs. The column still stands today in Rome, though weathered by time, a silent testament to the philosopher-emperor who never wanted to be a warrior but became one out of duty. And somewhere, in the imperial archives or in the baggage of a soldier who had served in Marcus's headquarters, were those private journals, those notes written in Greek by lamplight on the Danube frontier. To himself, Marcus had called them, or perhaps they had no title at all. They would survive, be copied, passed down, translated, printed, read by millions. They would become the Meditations, one of the most influential books ever written. Marcus Aurelius had spent his life trying to master himself, to live according to reason and virtue, to do his duty without complaint. He had not always succeeded. He had made mistakes, misjudged people, failed to prevent the disasters that followed his death. But he had tried, harder than most, to be good. And in the end, that is all any of us can do. Look to the rising sun, he had said. But it is the setting sun that we remember, the light of Marcus Aurelius's example still shining across 2,000 years, teaching us that the good life is not about what happens to us, but about how we respond, that virtue is the only true good, that we should focus on what we can control and accept what we cannot, that death is natural and nothing to fear, and that each day is an opportunity to live according to our highest principles. The philosopher-emperor is dead, but his words live on, whispering to us still, reminding us, encouraging us, challenging us to be better than we are. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy any person can leave, not monuments or conquests, but wisdom that endures, words that comfort and guide, a life that inspires others to live more fully, more courageously, more justly. Marcus Aurelius never wanted to be emperor, but in the end, he became something greater than an emperor. He became an example for all time of what it means to strive for wisdom, to serve duty over pleasure, to maintain integrity under pressure, and to face death with calm acceptance. His journey is complete. His sun has set, but its light remains.